Go over a couple of different questions from the quiz. Got number 7 is this first one, and then I'll go over 17 directly after it. So this is on quiz 1.6 to 1.8 as well. So this is using the distance formula in this case, because this section was on distance formula and midpoint formula. So remember your distance formula. So I've got D is going to be equal to the square root, and this is going to be the distance between 2 points of x1 minus x2 squared, so that whole thing squared, plus, and then the same thing with the y's. So I'm going to have y1 minus y2. And all that will be squared as well. Okay. Now, what I usually show in my classes as well, some of them remember Pythagorean theorem from when they took Algebra 1. It just depends on what teacher you had, whether you learned it or not. But you could also use Pythagorean theorem for distance. Okay. Now, when I go to find the first distance between A and B here, you'll notice that it is a horizontal line. So that means when it's a horizontal line, or if it was a vertical line, I can actually just count the blocks. So if I look from A to B, I would be walking 6 blocks. Okay. Same thing with C to D. Now, when I go to find the distance between D and B, that's when I can use the coordinates here and plug in my x1, x2, y1, y2. Okay, so in this case, I'd have my distance is equal to the square root of my x1, in this case between B and D, was 4 minus 0. So make sure you're subtracting the x values here. Okay. It doesn't really matter which order that you subtract the x's. You could have done x2 minus x1. Because it'll kind of cancel out when we get to the squaring part anyway. As long as you're subtracting the x values, the 4 and the 0, from each other. Okay, and then for the y's, I've got to subtract 2 minus a negative 1. So remember, when I subtract by a negative, it's the same thing as adding. So then my distance is going to be the square root. So I have 4 squared is 16 plus 2 minus negative 1 is 3. When I square that, I end up with 9, which means that my distance, or my length, is the square root of 25. So that means my distance or my length is 5 in this case. Okay, so I'd have 5. When I go to do AC, plug back in, we're also going to get 5. But I'm going to show AC the second different way. I think this second way is actually a little bit easier if you know the Pythagorean theorem from last year. If not, you can kind of skip this little part of the video. So basically, what I'm going to do between A and C here, I'm going to make that the hypotenuse of a right triangle. So I'm going to kind of draw on a right triangle here. And you may remember that the Pythagorean theorem says that if we've got a right triangle, then A squared plus B squared is going to equal C squared. Okay. And remember for this one, C is the longest side, or that hypotenuse. Okay. So in this case, when I go to form that little right triangle, this vertical side is 3. The horizontal side is 4. So in this case, I would have 3 squared plus 4 squared equals C, which is your hypotenuse, or your length in this case, squared. So then I have 9 plus 16 equals C squared. So 25 equals C squared. And when I go to take the square root, I get C of 5. So either way, you get that length as 5. Me personally, again, I think Pythagorean theorem is easier. But if you didn't learn it from last year, then you can just use the distance formula here, which is this big, long drawn out formula. Just be aware that the distance formula is not given to you on the SOL. So if you're going to be using that for length, make sure that you have it memorized. Okay. So since I'm finding perimeter, I've got the length of all 4 sides. I had 5, 5, 6, and 6. Perimeter, I just need to add up those sides, and you should get 22. Right, so for 17 here, again, I'm using the distance formula, okay? Now, when I have this one, it says line segment AP has an endpoint A on the origin. Remember, your origin is at the center of your graph, and that would be coordinate 0, 0, okay? So we're going to find the distance between these 2 points here, and we're going to compare them. But since it's multiple choice, if you got it again, you basically would have to compare all 4. We're just going to look at 2 here. So it wants me to find the longest. Okay. So when I go to look at my points, remember I've got x and y coordinates. Okay. So when I plug into my distance formula, so I've got my distance is going to be the square root of now remember I've got to subtract my x values. So if I'm looking at answer choice A here, I've got 0 minus negative 6 squared, using that same distance formula as number 7, plus, now I got to subtract my y's, 0 minus 4 squared. So then, when I kind of combine, do a little algebra here, I'm going to have the square root of 6 squared plus the negative 4 squared. So that's all still under the square root. Remember, when you square negative 4, you'll end up getting a positive, okay? So 6 squared is 36, plus negative 4 squared is 16. So my distance is going to be the square root of 52 when I add those together. Okay. So remember, these are still under the square root. When I go to take the square root of 52 in my calculator, you end up getting 7.2. Okay. So the distance for that first one, or the length for that first one, is 7.2. Okay. Now, the next one I'm going to do between 2, 8, and 0, 0. Okay. So now they've changed what the second point is, but my first point is still at the origin. Okay. So now I've got 0 minus, now the x value is 2. Then I have for the y's 0 minus negative 8. Okay, so 0 minus 2 is just negative 2. So I've got negative 2 squared plus 0 minus negative 8 is 8 squared. So negative 2 squared is 4. 8 squared is 64. When I combine like terms, I get the square root of 68. And the square root of 68 is going to be 8.2. So it asks for the longest one. So that is answer choice B, because answer choice A is slightly smaller. If you kind of want to see another way that they're kind of trying to lay this out, because I think sometimes that question can be a little confusing. We're trying to find the distance between this origin right at the center there. That's my point A. So I'm talking about right here at the center. And another point B. So if I'm looking at like the correct answer here, I would be at 2, negative 8. So it would be over 2 and down 8 to get to that B point. Okay, so I would basically be trying to find this diagonal distance between A and B here. Alright, so if you still have questions, just shoot me an email, and